Briar Rose, Chapter 5. Becca had a friend overnight for the first time, and Gemma promised them a story at bedtime. "She'll tell Sleeping Beauty if we ask," Becca said. "She tells it best." The part about the curse frightened them both. "When you are 17, Gemma said, the wicked fairy said, my curse will come true. You will lie down, and a great mist will cover the castle, and everyone will die. You too, princess." And then Gemma gave a witch's laugh, high and horrible. "Quick, Gemma, say the rest of it," Becca begged, half hidden under the covers. Her friend Shirley spooned around her. "What about the spinning wheel? What about the needle?" Shirley whispered, her breath stirring Becca's hair and blowing hotly against her neck. Becca elbowed her into silence. "But one of the good fairies," Gemma said, "had saved a wish. Not everyone will die, a few will just sleep. You, princess, will be one." Shirley sat up in bed, furious. "That's not how it goes. You've got it wrong." Gemma smiled. "That's how it goes in this house," Becca said. "And if you don't like it, you're not my best friend anymore." "I want to go home," Shirley said. "I don't feel good. My tummy hurts and my throat wants to swallow up." They took her home. She and Becca remained friends in school, but they never stayed overnight again. Becca never invited her. Chapter 6. The house was silent when Becca got up, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She had not been able to sleep. The room had seemed too hot, and she'd thrown off the covers with a sweeping, almost imperial gesture. Not 5 minutes later, the room was freezing, and she had to scrabble around, recovering both blanket and quilt. After 2 hours of successively sweating and shivering, she gave up and got up, checking the clock radio on her bedside table. As she watched, the numbers ticked over from 1:59 a.m. to 2 a.m. Sighing, she put her feet over the side of the bed, feeling around for her slippers. Then she went downstairs, belting her flannel robe as she went. She got out a handful of chocolate chip cookies from the blue and white cookie jar and padded into the living room, clicking through the 36 cable stations. She found 3 softcore movies, one of which she'd already seen, some stale news, and the Weather Channel promising rain in Texas and a heat wave in Phoenix. When she found herself staring at a test pattern for more than a few seconds, she clicked off the television with rather more vehemence than warranted and went back into the kitchen. The cookie jar was empty except for 3 stale Fig Newtons. She hated Fig Newtons, even when they weren't stale, but she ate them anyway. Wandering into the dining room, she turned on the light. The patchwork of papers still littered the table. She walked around the table slowly, trying to pretend the collection of old photos in mysterious forms and newspaper clippings were not worth a night's sleep. Gemma was just not there in the end. She whispered, "This means nothing." It didn't surprise her that the inflections were Sylvia's and not her own. She pulled out a chair and sat at the head of the table by the wooden box. After a minute, she put her hand on the box top and pressed down hard enough so that the carving of Briar Rose imprinted on her palm. Then she lifted her hand so she could see the outline clearly. "It's no good," she whispered, meaning it was no good trying to convince herself the pieces of paper were unimportant. The fact that Gemma had them tucked away in a box all these years, carrying the box with her to the nursing home, had to mean something. Gemma, Genevieve, Donna, good old Briar Rose, whoever. All at once, as if the words were being spoken aloud, she heard her grandmother telling the story of Sleeping Beauty. The room was suddenly filled with it. Once upon a time, when all times and no times, but not the very best of times, there was a castle, and the queen went to bed and gave birth to a baby girl with a crown of red hair. Becca touched her own springy red hair and smiled. She and Gemma, the family roses, Daddy called them. Like most redheads, Becca hadn't had a full head of hair until she was nearly 2. But in fairy tales, anything was possible. She looked around guiltily in case anyone had seen her gesture, but no one else was up. So the king said it was time for a party with cake and ice cream and golden plates, and not to mention invitations sent to all the good fairies in the kingdom, but not the bad fairy, not the one in black with big black boots and silver eagles, Becca said aloud. She wondered, and not for the first time, if her own ability to tell a story, to invent details, came from Gemma. Inventing details was not a gift a journalist should cultivate. "I curse you and your father the king, and your mother the queen, and all your uncles and cousins and aunts, and all the people who bear your name." Becca shuddered. It was only a story after all. She had heard it 100 times. But suddenly it occurred to her that in fact Gemma had no one else to tell who bore her name. No mother, no father, no husband, only a daughter who had 3 daughters. Maybe that was why she had been so obsessed with the story of Briar Rose. Just a fairy tale, she whispered to herself, a kind of comfort, but in this house of death there is no comfort at all. The good fairy had promised not death but sleep, and after all, then what was so bad about sleeping? She and Shanna and Sylvia had talked about it over and over. And then all at once Becca's childhood question was answered. It's not the sleeper who minds, it's the ones left behind awake. Gemma's story never ended happily, even after, except for the Princess Briar Rose and her own little girl. There had always been something decidedly odd about the whole telling. Only now was Becca able to admit it. In Gemma's story, everyone other than the prince who wakes the princess with a kiss on Briar Rose and afterwards their child, everyone else sleeps on. But what about, and Gemma's voice came back, the dark words tumbling across the dining table. Everyone slept, lords and ladies, teachers and tumblers, dogs and doves, rabbits and rabbits, and all kinds of citizens. Becca took a deep breath, and the sound of Gemma's words seemed to fade. In the storybook she read in school, everyone got to wake up at the prince's kiss. But in Gemma's version, the implication was that they all still slept under the wicked fairy's sentence of death. Death by sleep. No wonder Shirley, what's-her-name, who had lived down the block, never wanted to come back and sleep over at her house again. Death by sleep. Gemma, what can you have been thinking of? Becca said fiercely. Then she yawned and picked up the photograph of the woman and child. And did you live happily ever after? She asked it. The woman stared straight out at the camera, her black eyes gazing past Becca. No matter how Becca moved the photo, the woman's eyes stared over her shoulder. The child, a finger in her mouth like a stopper, lay with closed eyes, head on her mother's breast. By the time the others were strangling down to breakfast, Becca had organized the contents of a box, falling asleep at the table, her head resting between two of 4 piles. One pile was photographs, the second clippings, the third documents, and the fourth what she called others. That included the ring, an envelope with 2 curls of hair, one gold and one red, a brass button, possibly from a uniform, and the torn half of an Italian train ticket. The clippings she had arranged in chronological order, the first from August 30th, 1944, the last from June 3rd, 1956. The photographs were impossible to date, only one had any kind of identification at all, though the same young woman appeared in each. She was clearly pregnant in all the photographs except the one in which she was holding the child. In all but that photo, she was wearing the same dress, the shapeless dark dress with a white piping at the collar and sleeves. They showed her standing a little apart from other people in front of a row of barracks, a bit of a lake or ocean appearing in the background behind the buildings. In each shot she held her right hand protectively over her belly and looked warily to the side of the photographer. It was the documents that Becca puzzled over the longest, 7 in all. One was the entry form into America with the same date as the oldest newspaper clipping. Another was a white paper 8.5 by 14 with Giddel Mandelstein's signature and careful penmanship at the bottom. It looked like a kind of visa. There was a birth certificate for Eve Stein, a certificate of citizenship with a photo of a soulman and still young Donna Stein, dated July 6, 1946, a rental agreement for an apartment on 12th Street and Avenue A in New York City, and an immunization register, finally bound in pale blue. There was a mortgage document for the house on School Street where Becca and her sisters had grown up. Gemma had bought it in 1953 for $8,500, 38 years ago. Signposts, Becca had whispered, turning each one over. But why had Gemma kept them secret, and what had any of them to do with the story of Briar Rose? Gemma, I'm trying, she had whispered to the silent room before falling asleep at the table, head on her hands. It was her mother who found her and woke her gently. Becca, go on to bed. You'll just make yourself sick this way, and I can't deal with you being sick right now. She blinked owlishly up at her mother, then sighed. Only promise you won't move anything. I have it all arranged. Promise you'll keep them out of the piles. By them she meant her sisters. But what about breakfast? Eat in the kitchen like always. Never mind what they say. Sylvia had complained once about how unsophisticated it was to eat at the kitchen table. But that was after she had married Mike, and they had a live-in nanny for Benjamin. Sylvia had taken French cooking lessons. She ate with candles. Promise? I promise, dear. Only then did Becca grudgingly go out to bed, but her sleep was fitful, disturbed by the screams of the 3 children as they raced up and down the stairs and through the halls.